Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Biblical Rogues Gallery, streaming on Trinity Radio and Deep Calls Deep, who is off. There is she. and Derek's here. We started with like a whole gang of people, and too many of our co-hosts are falling off, being lazy. That's okay, though. Somebody actually complained about the, here it is. The clickbait isn't doing you any favors, in my opinion. Yeah, I don't do that stuff. But there is a biblical fact that might shock you, because we're going to read a passage tonight that uses the word grace a lot. And so obviously that means Calvinism, right? Or maybe it doesn't. But yeah, I don't do the, I am very bland. And I would have on both the thumb and on the title, Romans 11 verses 1 through 10. But because of the fact that I don't know how to do titles and thumbnails, my fitness channel has been around for, I don't know, 3 years now. And I have like just barely over 1,000 subs. So Trinity Radio has, I don't know, 22,000 subs, and Braxton knows what he's doing and I don't. So I'm not in charge of that, but I just thought I would clear that up. Amber, how are you doing?
It's the last week of the semester. Next week is finals, so I am sleep deprived and loving it. So yeah, things are good.
Good. Derek, always, you are my like, you're my rock. You've been here since close to the beginning and you just keep showing up.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you were like, hey, do you want to possibly come on sometime? Like, you're welcome anytime. I was like, I don't know, man. Are you sure about that? And now I look back, I'm like, nah, I probably added a lot of life to this, huh?
You did, because people would be miserable if it was just me. So, but Amber's here, and she has a channel, and you have a channel, and you don't really do much on your channel. Pastor Hefe says, I spent $20 on the super chat. Can't even post the org gift of him yelling nerds. Yeah, we are nerds. Beeler is loyal. Yes, he is. He's my friend. And I've yet to meet, actually, I haven't met either one of you in person yet, but I talk to y'all more than I talk to most people that live in Evansville. So.
Yep.
Because I'm either at home or at the office. I don't go out much. Though Will and Braxton, they've tried to make me more sociable, but I just
no play to your strengths, right?
That's right. Look, I mean, the closer I get to 50, which is not far, I'm a little over 2 years away from 50. I turned 48 next March. So, but the more I like, I saw a comedian. He was like, when you're 30, you're like, I'm bringing my own car. But when you get 40, it's like, after 40, you're like, I resent you for even asking me to go somewhere. And that's kind of how I am. I'm like, the answer is going to be no. Nick Quint from the New Testament Theologist is joining us. How you doing, Nick?
Yay.
Give me 1 sec. I'm working on a tech issue.
You're working on. You got a haircut in the past, I don't know, week or two, I can tell.
Oh my gosh, Pritchett.
Yeah.
My buddy just, I don't know if you can see it. He just texted me that. You see from,
oh yeah,
he's like nerds.
Yeah, we are nerds, or geeks, I think is what they call it. But yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about has God rejected Israel? The answer is given in the first verse, and it's very emphatic. So there's no mystery here. But yeah. Paul has to address that question. If you've been following along, or if you've ever read the book of Romans ever in your life, you know this part of the text. Romans 9 through 11 is dealing with the question of national Israel and the expansion of bringing in the Gentiles and how all that shakes out at the time that Paul is writing, and then implications for the future. We recently had Dr. David Allen on Trinity Radio to talk to Braxton and I about his new book, and I'm working my way through it. I'm not sold on it, but it's a neat idea. but I'm interested in his next version because if you've been following along, he said that the idea of supersessionism or replacement theology, I don't like either one of those terms. I'm more of a grafting in kind of guy, but I've been leaning that way. But I want to get him on when we get those passages because I want to be challenged on that because I don't have a firm commitment. But if watching my comments as we go along, and the more I study this, the more I'm leaning towards that view. Does anyone else have a view on that? I know that's not going to be what we talk about until we get to.
You on what? I was sorry, I got distracted. What were we talking about?
Verse 26. And so all Israel, what does he mean by Israel? Is that just?
That's a fun question.
Yeah,
that's a fun question. We did 5 hours of live stream a weekend or so ago on Faith Unaltered and my channel back to back on who is Israel. And didn't come up with an answer.
Yeah, I mean, if it was, I have my leanings, but if it was just super obvious, there wouldn't be a debate like every other Bible verse. But that's how it goes. But tonight we're just going to talk about verses 1 through 10. Has God rejected Israel? Nick, why don't you read, because the NASB is your favorite version of the Bible, but even though I know you don't like it, I'm being facetious, you have such a good reading voice.
Depends on how my tech is doing. How's my tech doing? Are you guys hearing me?
Sound
okay?
fine. You
Sounds
sound
good.
I sound like I'm bouncing off every single wall, in this little broom closet Braxton shoved me into, but
Well, we all know you're in the closet, JP. It's all good. I love you. All right, so here we go. Already I'm on the I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? Far from it. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, since otherwise grace is no longer grace. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. That sounds like the King's English. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. May their eyes be darkened to not see, and bend their backs continually. The word of the Lord.
Amen. You're muted.
We like it that way.
yeah, everyone, that's how it's preferred. Yeah, so here we've got like what? 1 Kings 19 verses 10 and 14.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy 29 shows up. Isaiah 29:10. Those are kind of smashed together. And then we have Psalm 69:22 and 23 in there.
Wait,
so
no.
the Old Testament continues to inform Paul's answers on these things.
We got Leviticus 26 in here, 1 Samuel 12, Psalm 94, Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah 33.
Yeah, so there's a question about, some of these texts, are they, because he does use some introductory formulas for several of these passages, but not for all of what you could say, or like 1 Samuel, for instance, would be one of them. So, I'm of the opinion that if it sounds Old Testament-y, it doesn't need an introductory formula to at least be a callback or echo or an allusion to it, if not necessarily an outright citation. But they debate. Maybe Paul's just riffing on common language, that everyone's familiar with. But I would say, given how much, if we go that route, then you would say that the one book of the Bible, and I know it's not written by Paul, but the one book of the Bible that has the most Old Testament in it without a single citation formula would be Revelation. And you just say, well, that's just coincidence, right? So I don't think there's anyone who wants to say that.
No.
But so I'm of the opinion that if you can detect something to an Old Testament passage, even without an introductory formula, you go with it. What say you, Nick? You're the Paul guy.
I mean, at the end of the day, you really don't need an introductory formula. Helps, but sometimes Paul just doesn't do it. I mean, David says is not a particularly great introductory formula, but it's there.
Yeah.
But you know that for as it is written and stuff like that. So there are formulas, and then Paul will just allude to things, and that's of course where we get echoes and allusions or intertextuality. Is Paul's not being so mathematical, so as to be writing as if this is a scientific textbook.
Yeah, and I think that personally, just rhetorically, I think that the introductory formulas are there for rhetorical purposes more than anything else. I mean, I don't like in the 21st century where nobody knows their Bible. If you were to just insert into regular speech, an entire Bible verse, if you didn't give the chapter and verse reference, nobody would believe it's in the Bible because they don't know their Bibles that well. But that's not what we're dealing with here. In fact, you could paraphrase, and I know that's kind of cheating, but there's so many translations out there that if you're just paraphrasing a certain biblical text, nobody would, a lot of people, I'm not saying nobody, but a lot of people wouldn't even know what you were doing when you could be spouting off entire pericopes of scripture. So, but that's not Paul's audience. And in the introduction video, like 32 episodes ago or whatever, we did talk about Paul's expectation for his audience to understand their Old Testament. So I think it's easier for most people to pick up on the introductory formulas, whichever one he uses. But everyone else, if you can detect it, it's because it's probably there. So yeah, you could say Jeremiah, 1 Samuel, but the big ones I think are the Kings, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalms. And I think that one of the things that was pointed out in the commentaries is that when Paul is doing that in this particular section, he is appealing to the three main bodies of literature for evidence, right?
Mhm.
Torah, the prophets, and the writings. He's saying all of this stuff agrees.
Yeah,
So
it's all
let's get into it.
Mhm.
Wait, Nick, were you about to say something?
No, the boss was.
Oh, Amber.
Yeah, no, I think it's all one of the really interesting things we got to do last semester was learn how to write interbiblical allusions, which are those invisible links that aren't specifically cited in between in a book itself and in between in a genre like in the prophets. So it was really interesting to start to learn the process of how to spot the invisible ones that aren't obviously cited. And it has to do with, like in the Old Testament, there's a lot of Hebrew language links. There's also like pneumatic devices and different things like that we learned how to do. So it's actually really fun to they start to learn to look for those.
Well, if you read enough commentaries, they all seem to find them if, all that's there if you read enough of them. Many of the semi-technical, and I try to glance at both technical and semi-technical commentaries. I mean, there's so many. I try to, because sometimes you find the best stuff in some of the semi-technical or even a pastoral commentary, but I don't have very many of those. But you can find good stuff in all of them. But between them all, you can usually get them. The technical commentaries will, or the critical commentaries will tell you that other people have found like 1 Samuel, and then they'll explain. I think Jewett is one who explains that they're there, and then Longenecker, for example, in his critical commentary, will explain why he thinks that Paul's not using it. certain things that are not. So you get a good mix by reading various commentaries. So I've read probably 25 different ones, and I keep checking new ones and discarding old ones that I found to be thoroughly unhelpful. I don't have time to read 25 different commentaries week to week, but
So who replaced your John MacArthur commentary on Romans?
I never once, I have his commentary. It belonged to my father, and I'll hang on to it forever, even though.
Oh, amen. Yeah, I'm sentimental about
Yeah.
it too. I get it. I got Wayne Grudem's first edition around here somewhere.
Yeah, I do too. My dad had the Wayne Grudem systematic theology, an old version of it, and because he was doing with what he could as a Sunday school teacher. And
the
like I
first
said,
book I ever read in seminary.
We Have Been Believers.
Yep, an African American systematic theology.
There
First
you
book I
go.
read in seminary. So pride of place on my shelf.
Yeah, but I'll hang on to those forever just because they belong to my dad. I mean, but in my dad's defense, he also had the entire Great Book set and the Annals of America.
Yeah, but did he have Karl Barth?
Thank goodness, no. That's just
It's a shelf killer. All right.
All right.
And
Voice
I have
one.
not consulted his book on Romans, which is not so much a Romans commentary, even though it's,
Although you'd be surprised, most people still use Barth's commentary.
yeah, but it's not really a commentary. All right, so in verse 1, I say then God has not rejected his people. Has he? Of course, rhetorical question. This section is filled with more rhetorical questions than usual. Far from it is his response. That's an emphatic no. And of course, he brings up the fact that he is an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and the tribe of Benjamin. Now, interesting facts about that is that Israel's first king, Saul, who Paul was named after, was also of the tribe of Benjamin, as was Elijah, who he's about to talk about. And some of the commentaries talk about how within Judah, Benjamin was like the anchor theocratic tribe for that kingdom in the south. So I guess that's kind of an interesting little tidbit there. But it seems like Paul is inserting himself here as, of course he hasn't, because look at my Israel credentials, obviously. So he's holding himself out as evidence that God has not forsaken Israel.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that, if I was a critic, right? This is kind of the Philippians 3 thing, right? Here are my street cred. But Paul, they've heard in Rome rumors about Paul, right? They've heard slanderous things about the gospel he preaches. And they probably know also his reputation. I mean, he goes in through Galatians about how he was the persecutor of a church, and that's how zealous he was. And we talked about zeal a couple of episodes ago, that zeal, not according to knowledge, could have just as well explained Paul as anyone. But if he's holding himself out, I'm just glad he appeals to the scriptures, because if they were a skeptical audience, I don't know that just being, unbiased, I don't know. Oh, okay, Paul. So you're the proof, right? You're the proof that God, you're just using yourself. That's kind of, because I mean, he could appeal to all sorts of people. He could have appealed to the apostles. He could have, the other apostles, the disciples with Jesus. He could have appealed to all the converts at Pentecost, but he says, nope, I'm proof.
I mean, it works fine. If I'm in a room full of liberal American Baptists and I have to tell people, hey, look, one of us isn't that, I'm going to say that very, very loudly so everyone in the back hears me.
Yeah.
It's a good way to separate yourself. It's a good way to flex on people too, which Paul kind of does a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he's saying he has not rejected his people because I'm his people. Here's my proof.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's being
like
a Protestant, individualized eschatology and soteriology.
Right, but I mean, why begin there? What's the strategy here for Paul to begin with this instead of like all the other available things he could say right there?
Well,
Mhm.
Moses probably wasn't part of all this, so the closest thing you have is Paul, and
Mm.
why
No,
wouldn't he?
you have Peter and James and all the other
Well,
apostles.
if that's the case, then it tells you how much Paul thinks of Peter.
Apparently, I mean, it tells how little he thinks of all. I mean,
I mean, you know,
his first
Paul didn't
proof
even know there was
here.
an empty tomb. Peter was second there, so
Yeah, I
I
know,
mean,
but yeah, okay, because he can't run as fast because he's,
because he's an old man.
I don't
Fair
know.
enough.
I just
He's
saw
lucky
it.
he wasn't third.
I'm just saying, what is his strategy here to say, of course, God has not rejected Israel because of me? How?
Well,
I mean,
I took it like God hasn't. Of course, God hasn't rejected Israel, obviously, because I'm talking to you as a
Mhm.
Christian, as a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
So
I think
obviously
it
he
goes back to
hasn't.
verse 9 too. Wish to be cut off and accursed and stuff like that. Basically, if there's one faith, I mean, we see this in the Old Testament. If there are 50 righteous people, 40, 30, 20, even
Mhm.
10,
yeah,
that one person is a testament to the faithfulness of God. And so here Paul's like, who else am I going to tell you about? Because I'm talking to you. And so
fair enough. I wish,
even if Paul did all this, you know, I wish to be accursed. I wish this is Paul at the height of his emotion, basically.
yeah, but
Like,
what I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, I mean, this is the I'm an Israelite. He's the one that wished he could be accursed. He's channeling the Moses thing and back in 9:3, 4, and 5. But it's just 9:3. But it's just I don't know. I don't get why he starts there. And I understand what you're saying, Derek. But I mean, just me trying to look at his strategy here. It's like obviously, yeah. You can say obviously, I'm. These are my credentials, so obviously he hasn't. But I mean, why not appeal to a wider pool of me and all of these others, people of authority?
well, that'll
Um,
happen in chapter 16, but
well, I know he name checks every single person he can think of, and he's trying to. That's him trying to increase his credibility. I heard a thing where people were talking about. My pastor, in fact, was talking about. Well, it shows that Paul was just thinking about so many different. I was like, that's not the point of that.
No, that's not the point at all.
I was like, I love you, Pastor
No.
Brett, but that's not. It's not because he's showing how much he cares about so many different. It's because he's trying to
No.
show the audience he knows people and they can vouch for him. Yeah, and he wants the money, right? So I really, I mean, just from I know, it's the Bible, so we're supposed to just say it's wonderful, but I'm just trying to understand it, and I don't think that that's like if they think that he is if he knows that they don't think highly of him because of false ideas about it, I don't know why he would present himself first as the evidence to this argument.
I mean, I could kind of see what you're saying. Like if he were to say, like, look at these people, and also look at me.
Right. You kind of say, yeah, there's Peter and then there's James and there's all these people baptized in Jerusalem that are Jews and
well, their
me.
apostleship's not under dispute.
Mhm.
So
I mean,
why
'cause
wouldn't
it
he?
kinda-
Why wouldn't he center? It's like Paul called an apostle of Jesus Christ in chapter 1, verse 1 through 7.
I understand, but if he's sitting in Corinth writing this letter, he knows what he wrote to Corinth.
Oh,
in
he ain't sitting. We
First
all know Paul's
Corinthians.
pacing and screaming into the
And
ether.
and what did he do in 1 Corinthians 15? It was least of all me after he name checks everyone else, including 500 random people that he doesn't even name. But here he doesn't do that, and so I just found that interesting. It's a bold strategy, Cotton, I guess. But
Well, there has been material. Do I have the? I'll probably have to eat my words later. But there's an article in one of these books over here that focuses on Paul as priest or as kind of fulfilling that priestly vocation out of the Old Testament, and so there may be that representational kind of figure that might play into that. Why he has no problem appealing to himself, of the seed of Abraham or a descendant of Abraham or a member of the tribe of Judah or of the tribe of Judah, and so that might be playing into that. He's not talking about Levi or the priests, but fulfilling that sort of vocational priesthood. Why not just be like, "Hi, fellas." And
right, yeah. I mean,
think you're overcomplicating it. I really do.
Well,
No,
I'm overcomplicating
I'm
because
not.
Pritchett's asking dumb questions. And
Well, then
No, I'm serious. I'm just
I'm kidding,
looking at.
Pritchett. I think it's an interesting question.
I'll just
Yeah.
come in and tie those two together. He's named after Saul, the first king. Then he references Elijah, the prophet, and then he's acting as priest. So you get prophet, priest, and king right there. See, I can speculate into really cool areas too.
How
If I don't
Protestant.
talk with my hands, the light goes out. This,
Break out the Italian, Pritchett.
yeah. No, I'm just saying he didn't do this in 1 Corinthians 15. He kind of name checked a bunch of people before he
Different
got to himself.
audiences.
And okay, yeah, but this audience doesn't know him as much as like the people.
Yeah,
in
so why would
Corinth.
he pivot to other people?
Well, maybe it has to do with that money he wants.
Okay, I realize that. Okay, I mean, obviously, it was the right thing to say. It's the Bible. We're all.
It's
we
okay
all have
to
a high
ask
view
what
of
was in his
Scripture,
head, though.
but I am just asking a
Mhm.
practical question because it just strikes me as odd. That's all. But I mean, back to the point is what you said, Derek. It's hey, I'm obviously no because look at me, I'm Jewish, and I'd be like, yeah, so what? But apparently the audience was. So verse 2 does a little bit better though, in my mind. And I'm not trying to, bag on the Bible. I'm just saying this is I just struck me as weird. I've read this a million times, but going over it this week, and I'm thinking to myself, all of the things that we think about doing this kind of commentary and what we know about Paul and his audience, I'm like, maybe if you're trying to score some points and prove yourself worthy, don't hold yourself out as the number one evidence to answer an objection when people don't think as highly of you as you're trying to get them to think. That's all I'm saying.
Paul's allowed to make anyway, boss, go ahead.
Can we just do a little bit of OT intertextuality here? Because this is a pattern that you see throughout, he starts off this with, did God reject his people? By no means, and claims himself to be an Israelite. And he references, we're going to get into references to Torah and the Ketuvim and the Nevi'im. And it's a pattern throughout, wrestling with from the very beginning, from, he goes back to references Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. Then we get into Elijah. We get into, references to Jeremiah. We're going to get into Psalms. All throughout, everywhere he hits is wrestling with the question of who is Israel? Who are the people of God? He is reminding everybody that we're still wrestling with settling this question of who is Israel, who are the people of God, because they didn't settle it in the prophets, and now we have to wrestle with it again because of Jesus. And we're wrestling with this question of the Old Testament through our new Christology that we get after the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know. So you have verse 1 where he talks about being of Benjamin, like you said. Goes with Saul, goes with Elijah, but I also saw it, he already said in chapter 9, like he singled out Ishmael, who was also a descendant of Abraham. So I kind of saw like being more specific, not only just Abraham, but also Benjamin. So, like the promised seed through Jacob, right?
Well, you got established. We're going back through patterns in the Old Testament. We're going back through re-wrestling all of these questions that we've already looked at. We're going to look at them again because we're going to talk about the ingrafting, and we're going to solidify that the Gentiles are a part of all of this when we get into 11 and following in the second half of this chapter. But he's setting back up to re-wrestle with this question of who is Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually already repeating, not just calling back to Romans chapter 4 and the whole discussion about Abraham and descendants of Abraham or seed of Abraham. But there's a lot of echoes of just repeating himself from what he was talking about in chapter 9 here in chapter 11. I've also
it seems almost like a reversal though. Like, why is Israel rejecting God? Why are they rejecting God? And he's like, but has God rejected them back?
Well, I mean, like verse 6 here that we'll get to anyway, it sounds just like Romans 9. Anyway, yeah, so he's just kind of going back over it. You're right, Amber, and we'll see what's added to that. Verse 2a says, no, of course they haven't been rejected. God has not rejected the people he foreknew. And of course, this is where the echoes of 1 Samuel and Psalm 94 come in. That's not explicit. There's no introductory formula, but it's said to be At least for Samuel 12:22a. I know I have an S there, but I meant to type A. But yeah, so this idea, God has not rejected his people. That his people language, of course, familiar to Hosea and familiar to other passages. First Samuel talks about this. That it's that language of his people that's drawing upon. And then Paul adds something that he said in Romans chapter 8, verse 29. This foreknew, and of course here he's talking about Israel previous to the time that he's writing, right? He's talking about the Old Testament saints. And the question arises for me is why some commentaries understand this here in 11, but yet somehow this means something different than Romans 8:29. Others go beyond that and say, no, this means what we've all been saying that Romans 8:29 has meant, which means this is all that before the foundation of the world stuff. God foreknew who, the Arminians, who would believe before creation, or those he foreknew is just like Augustine would say, this is redundant for predestination.
You just even you can't see that in this verse though, just by reading the verse. Like, why he's asking, like, has God not rejected God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. The people that are being discussed here aren't believers. So to me, that would be a strange reading to all that metaphysical baggage you were just talking about, because he's talking about people who are not saved, right?
I wonder. So in verse 2, the has not rejected his people. So the question, of course, is but Paul doesn't answer the who your people are in 2b. Do you not? And I've got the NIV up, so sorry. Don't you know what Scripture says in the passage about Elijah? So you have to go to the next verse. Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the one left, and they're trying to kill me. So okay, who's the they? Doesn't say. Then verse 4. Well, what is God's reply? I have kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so that 7,000. So as you could see a parallelism between Paul and Elijah in terms of the singular representative, the priestly figure, the speaker, and my people would be the 7,000 in terms of parallel. And then then the question about who we know who he foreknew is probably that 7,000, at least in the sense that Paul is using the term here. So that's the literal
Augustine
reference.
says that. And the gift of perseverance, Augustine says, predestination is sometimes designated by the name of foreknowledge, as here, where he foreknew can only mean he predestined, as the context.
Foreknow means predetermined everything beforehand, and predetermined everything beforehand. Yes, okay, no, then the words have no meaning.
Okay, right, so are we saying God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew? Are we saying that is the remnant, or he is referring to Israel there and then going towards a remnant afterwards?
I say the latter. And I say that's exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans 8:29. But
go ahead, boss.
I think what we've got going to this makes my brain go back to Deuteronomy 30, the end of Deuteronomy 32 and Joshua 1. And both of those work together. Those two chapters work together, and you get, when you go through there, you've got Moses giving his last admonition to the people. I know you're going to be stupid. I know you're going to get out. I know you're going to lose the land, but you're going to get brought back. And we walk into Joshua, and Joshua starts with, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's not nice little something you put on a coffee mug in your house. That's a spiritual war declaration. That is making a choice. Are you in or are you out? And I think Paul is making people's mind go back to the ones who are that God foreknew are the ones that God knew because of the pattern of Israel's behavior, who were going to choose to be in and not choose to be out. They were going to make the choice of Yahweh and not all of the idols and other things that Israel was always chasing instead of God.
So are we saying on the basis? Well, no, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I'm 100% on board with that. So how does that work then with, so skipping down to verse 5, because Paul's, so those whom he foreknew, The closest would probably be verse 5. Therefore, likewise, okay, there's hutas un kai. Okay, so I have to render that differently. But so too at the present time is what we'll just go with. There is a remnant. I don't like chosen by grace because I'm not quite certain in verse 5. So if that's the case, then is Paul speaking about his people being the remnant, or is he speaking about the remnant from the people that God, or that they have maintained covenant faithfulness to him, have been loyal to him, and have, as you said, I'm with you on that. Sir, we will serve the Lord despite what the people do. I mean, and that fits actually with the pattern of the prophets. You know, there's always a righteous remnant who is faithful
Yeah,
to
I would
Yahweh,
say,
and
I would say,
all that sort of stuff.
I would say he appeals to the remnant generally, and then those faithful Israelites throughout the centuries prior to Paul's writing, and then he zeroes in on that particular passage from where's that, First Kings or whatever. Cosmic Septic has I love that name. Is it inconsistent to hold that foreknown in Romans 8 and 11 are different concepts? Yes, I think so. Not necessarily, but I do think so. Like one meaning known before in the simple sense, and the other complex, timey-wimey stuff. Well, technically not timey-wimey because there would be no time prior to creation if, going by standard physics or whatever. But I think it's inconsistent because I think Paul basically means the same thing. He's talking about the reason why, and go watch the whole episode just to sum up what I think is the reason we know that all things work together for those who love God is because the way that we know that is because it has in the past, because it worked out for the ones that God foreknew. They were also predestined.
And you can also just look at the way that verb is used in the cognates. In Acts 26:5, they've known for a long time. Like time is a different word. So it's like, and then you go to, I'm sure we've talked about this just for a recap. 1 Peter 1:20, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, indicating that foreknowledge doesn't always have to be before the foundation of the world in some sort of eternal decree. And so I think you could argue, I'm not saying I would accept this. You could argue that Romans 8 is a different sense of it, because you could argue that soteriological, or at least you might say in terms of sanctification, so soteriologically informed sanctification. And here you're talking far more about history and narrative. So it's not that the terms mean different things, but they function differently, because one is focused not on narrative, because Romans 8 is not about narrative, at least in the historical narrative or the reconstruction. Paul hasn't gotten to historical reconstruction. That's what Romans 9 through 11 is all about. Here, Romans 1 or 11 and verse 2 would fulfill that narratival reconstruction of what foreknowledge is. And that's not about predetermination. That's God's godness of knowing what happens in God's world.
See, and that's why I was kind of going along those lines whenever I was reading that, because it's like he hasn't rejected his people Israel, whom he foreknew, because he was always in covenant with them, but he hasn't rejected them because within his people is a faithful remnant. So it's like he wasn't destroying all of Israel because there were a faithful remnant. So in that case, it wouldn't be soteriological. Like foreknow doesn't have to be like an intimate salvific knowledge of a people, but it could be a referent to like maybe covenant people or people he was in close relationship with.
Well, and then you get the issue. Do you not know what the scripture in verse 2 says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against, or kata Israel? So you have, not to be crass about it, but you have tiers of people all within the block, the thing. But
he made that point in Romans chapter 9, though.
Yeah, but here you're getting
within Israel, God has always had.
Well, Romans 11 is Paul trying to answer the questions he brought up and hasn't solved in Romans 9 and 10. Well, Romans 1 through 10, basically. Romans 9 is his way of, all right, we're going to recapitulate all this and finally answer the questions that I've been kind of dilly-dallying around. Sorry, boss, you were going to say something. I was going
to say, like, that's okay. And sometimes the question of the remnant isn't always necessarily people, because if you go back to the book of Ruth, you've got this idea that the knowledge of God is preserved throughout, because Ruth is happening during the book of Judges. So the knowledge and traditions of God are preserved through the book of Ruth. And then at the end of the book of Ruth, what happens? We get to Samuel, and we get to the line and the genealogy of David. And so it's sometimes the remnant is the preservation of Israel's tradition, of the knowledge of Yahweh, the practices and the following of those. So sometimes it's a religious remnant, sometimes it's a physical remnant. There's a lot of different ways that can be a remnant.
And there's still corporate groups based on people.
You're muted, Pritchett.
Longenecker argues that this whole section of 9 through 11 is all about Second Temple remnant theology, and we kind of went over what his case for that a few episodes ago. Whatever one makes of all that, that's certainly Paul's point here, and it certainly draws from the tradition of the prophets. So,
well, all of this to say, foreknowledge doesn't mean predetermination from the foundation of the world based on some esoteric decree created in the 16th century.
No, I agree.
Silly and facetious.
Right, and I think who he meant here is the way that he's using the word foreknow here is the way that he was using foreknow in Romans 8:29. And what I don't think it was predetermination, eternal decrees, and all of that. That's not what Paul's on about in this section. Not to say that Paul can't talk about that stuff, and we can have out in Ephesians 1, even there I have questions. Pro katabalis cosmu and the meaning of that. I don't think it's just settled that means pre-temporal creation logically prior to the it possibly means that, but I'm not 100% on that. I'm like 51-49, I guess. I'm leaving that question open, but that's not what Paul's on about anywhere here. He's trying to argue Jew-Gentile stuff in light of Jesus and where everyone stands. And so, obviously here, I think the people he foreknew would be the faithful remnant, and then he's going to use an example because he's going to go appeal to Torah and the prophets and the writings all say what this has happened before. So, I mean, not to get Battlestar Galactica on you, but this has happened before and it's going to happen again, or it's happening right now. So
there may be a caveat to this too. It could be, you could make this point, verses 2 through 4, we'll just take that as a specific unit. That could be corporate Israel, all Israel. And then the hutos in verse 5, which would function as kind of a likewise or in this manner or thusly, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace.
Right, because there's always been a remnant, no matter.
Well, but here's the thing. Now, at the present time, like when Paul, but so that brings up the question: is Paul talking about a past event? Well, it's past. Everything's past to us, but a past event in Israel's history, like the times of Elijah and Isaiah and stuff, or is he talking about the Christ event, or is he talking about like what is that present time in verse 5? Because that may color that foreknow, that may color the people, the question of personhood or ethnicity or corporate group, because you have specifically so too, and the ESV renders it this way, and the NIV too. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. They're virtually identical with the exception of a comma in the NIV, which is weird. But yeah, so likewise, or therefore likewise, also at the present time, a remnant chosen according to grace.
Yeah.
Or there is a remnant chosen according. So are we talking about where is that remnant placed in relation to the foreknow? Does that make sense? Because if you take foreknow as past people group, Israel, that doesn't actually work with what he then says now, unless you could make it work, but I'm not going to.
This is in light of this is obviously in light of Christ, right? I mean, this is obviously the present time, everything after the resurrection. I mean, that's what Paul means. Obviously.
Are you sure about that? That's
yeah, I'm absolutely sure. It's apocalyptic, Nick, and that is
sure.
That is.
I'm fine saying that, but
I mean, the present time is the time in this apocalypse of Jesus, this unveiling. But I don't know. I'll let the apocalyptic theologians disagree with you because
Well, no, it's an issue that I'd love to hear you and David Allen address that, because if these people whom he foreknew refers to what you think it refers to, I don't have I know what it is. I just can't. It's not front of mind, if that makes sense.
The people he foreknew, Paul is saying, the people he foreknew is the people in the past, like the remnant that he's going to use as an example of the types of people that he foreknew.
Well, then you have a shift in time. So you're saying,
yeah, and he says, and in the same way, then there's also been one now in the present age of Jesus.
okay, yeah, I'm just asking you what's to tease that out. That's all I'm asking. I'm just not.
And I'm saying those people, Paul is saying those people then are like, and just as that happened, where Elijah was like, "Oh, look at me, I'm the only one," and God's like, "No, there's still people in Jerusalem because, I've they didn't bow the knee and kiss Baal and whatever," and it's like, and so then Paul goes on to say, and just like now, there's still this remnant according to God's gracious choice. But that's just my take on this.
No, that's what I was asking.
So,
I was genuinely curious. It was
once again, let me wrap my head around this. Are you saying God has not? Paul is making the point God has not rejected his faithful remnant, or God has not rejected Israel proper because of his faithful remnant?
Yes, I just yes to that. That whole thing, yes. It's not one or the other. It's just yes.
Well, because then you might have multiple problems.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't.
Because that'll
you
so, okay,
had
no, Pritchett, no. I've got the nose. I'm talking first. Keep all this in mind when we get to Romans 11:25 through 32, and I'll leave it at that, and I'll let you have the last word on that, because I think you've created a major issue with this. But Amber, I'll kick to you.
I have a question. Yeah, I just have a question
Major issue in
mostly
a facetious way. Obviously, I don't think it's a huge issue, but anyway, go ahead, boss. Sorry.
a question for Nick. Is this 5 and 6? Is this prescriptive or descriptive?
What do you mean? In what sense?
I mean, is he talking in a way that he's describing this present time remnant according to God's gracious choice, but if by grace, no longer based on works otherwise? So is this is he describing what's happening, or is this a prescriptive?
No, I think it's
description of what's happening.
I think it's descriptive. I don't think
what would the remnant be? Because he's talking about Jew. Okay, so here's another question. I'm sorry to bring this all up. Is he talking about Jewish remnant, because that's the immediate analog?
Yes.
Or is he talking about Jew Gentile at the present time in the relation to the Christ event? Because the only way to bring that, hold on, Pritch, I see where you're going. Just only way to bridge that is to argue kind of what Heiser pointed out, typological fulfillment. Kind of this fulfills, or what he calls, I heard him use it. I've used similar language, so I'll just steal it because shout out to him. Rest in peace, King. Pattern fulfillment. That this fulfills a certain analog or function or telos that is summed up here. And so that's kind of my sense of it. But there is that issue of, how much do you take those people who foreknew Israel and then extrapolate it now to that? So I don't know if it's Paul making a problem for himself, or your interpretation of Paul that's making a problem, or it could be I'm not seeing it and just I'm putting pebbles in my own shoe.
No, because Longenecker actually addressed this issue in his commentary, and I just read this today.
Please, okay, then good. I haven't read Longenecker, so please, the floor is yours. I'll shut up.
So he actually addressed that question, because he was like, now, obviously, Paul's primary concern here is descendants of Abraham, Israel, that have converted to Christianity. But he also points out that there is a sense in which he's already roping in the way that he did in 9:24 and 25, not only from the Jews, but also the Gentiles. And if you're reading these, side by side, Romans 9 and Romans 11, it would be hard to say that while he is primarily having Israelites, like ethnic Israel, in mind here as the remnant, you can't say that he's not also roping in all of the Gentiles as part of that remnant. Simply, especially if you consider at the time of Paul's writing, the mission is still in progress, right? so it's not like the entire Gentile world has converted and like, you know, in the billions or sorry, the millions. But I mean, you know, so Longenecker, his way is while primarily Paul is trying to say with the idea that, you know, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, you know, I'm descendant of Abraham. He's primarily talking about national Israel that are believers in Jesus, but you can't exclude anymore the Gentile believers that and that's what you want to say, which also has implications for how we read verse 26 in a week or two. So yeah, I mean,
Well, just to be fair, I'm not settled on what I think about that 25 through 29 or so. I'm not settled on that.
I'm not either.
I've read 5 different academic articles, Jason Staples, and all that. I'm just like, oh my gosh. Okay.
But I'm fine with Longenecker saying that while that's not primarily who he has in mind here, you can't rule it out either, because Paul is talking in the same way that Paul was narrowing the scope of Israel in chapter 9. It was also broadening God's eschatological people with the inclusion of the Gentiles. Paul's going to get to the purpose of that later in this chapter, but he's saying you can't exclude the idea in Paul's mind that the present time remnant is also the Gentile believers to whom Paul is, you know, talking to now, the majority of the Gentile believers in Rome, that they could see themselves, given what Paul said in chapter 9, as part of that remnant, because if there is a remnant of Israel in Jesus and they're team Jesus too, there's no error in their mind or in their judgment by identifying with the remnant. And so I think that I could go as far as what Longenecker is saying there, because I agree that primarily Paul is thinking, because, you know, this is dealing with the nation of Israel, but you can't just rule out the fact that he wouldn't include Gentile believers at the present time as part of the remnant, because what's true of them is true of Jesus, true of all the believers, Jew or Gentile. So yeah, I'm okay
Derek?
with what Longenecker was saying there. I'm like, yeah, to say that this is just dealing with national Israel and a remnant within national Israel, you're going to have a hard time given what Paul said. But that also, you know, Romans 9:26 and following.
Derek, boss?
I'm just following the discussion.
Okay. I didn't want it to be me and Pritchett having a slugfest. I got one thing to say, but I'll kick it to boss.
Okay. Well, I'm just wondering, because I think in the pattern through the Old Testament, Gentiles were always included, but they were included to become the nation of Israel. They became ethnically Jewish as a part of assuming the identity of Israel. And this is a playing out and a repeating. And Paul is over and over and over for 3 chapters now, 9, 10, and 11, reminding us again and again and again of that pattern of the Old Testament, of being in relationship with God, rejecting God, of outsiders always being included, of the wrestling of the prophets of who are the people of Israel. It's a lot of thematic patterns woven together that I can't quite put my brain around. So, Nick, why don't you?
Well, I mean, that goes back to the foreknew thing.
Your name's not Nick. Your name's not Nick. Your name's not Nick. You didn't get handsomer and change your name. Go ahead, Rich. I'll let you go.
No, I was just saying that also bumps you back into the question with what she said, that since Gentiles have always been, you know, on the periphery, but included throughout the Old Testament, right? I mean, well, Jesus' genealogy makes that clear. I mean, so even that goes back to the foreknew question, not primarily, but yeah, you can rope them in as part of, you know, the foreknown.
Yeah, and so there is, and I've been reading a little on this. I need to read more on it. There's a huge debate over ethnicity, Israel as ethnicity and Israel as identity. Because ethnicity, Israel has never been an ethnically homogenous thing, because the Egyptians left with them and people are always converting and all this sort of, converting is not the right term, but coming to be
being included.
Incorporated. And so the issue I have, and I'll leave it here because I don't think we'll settle this tonight, and I don't think we'll settle Romans 11:25 through 29 either. is you've got, the foreknow, all this sort of stuff. Then verse 7, Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. We know that's probably, we'll say, Israel as identity. Nation's probably not correct because there's people outside Israel, there's Jewish people and, well, Jews outside the nation, and people who are the identity of them are outside the nation too. So Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking, but the elect obtained it. So if the elect there and the remnant there are taken presently as a present example of a past event or past incorporative event, then you can say, yes, the elect and the remnant are both Jew and Gentile, or pagan and Jewish, or however we want to construct that.
But verse 7 is a restatement of 9:30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, attain righteousness, but the righteousness that is by faith. Or verse 31, however, Israel pursuing a law of righteousness did not arrive by that. It's kind of a restatement of that.
Well, it's actually, it's weird, Pritchett, now that you said that, Paul was precise and to the point here. Here, he's made it more ambiguous because he doesn't, unless he's assuming that we're taking, that meaning is coming with it from verse 9, chapter 9, then we got a problem. Or at least Paul has made it more ambiguous, or ambiguous isn't the right term, nebulous, because you have the remnant chosen by grace, however we translate chosen in verse 5. We'll just say chosen by grace.
Well,
and
he becomes less nebulous.
The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So the rest of, and so you can see where the issue is of Israel as ethnos or people versus Israel as identity, and that's a huge debate in the literature right now that we are scratching at. Just like,
well, obviously the Gentiles weren't the ones that were hardened, right? Because the Gentiles are coming in as the time of Paul's writing.
Yes,
but not all Jews are hardened because Jews are coming in. The ones.
Well, but I think my reading is this, and it's a reading in the sense of 51 to 49 reading. I think Paul has Israel as identity throughout verses 1 through 10. I don't think he has Gentile. You can do with the long neck thing primary, but I'll just say to make myself have to do legwork later, I don't think Paul has Gentiles are not front of mind in verses 1 through 10.
Yeah, but Longenecker doesn't disagree with that. He's just saying it's okay if you want to, if you're a Gentile believer and see yourself as part of this remnant at the time of Paul's writing, that's fine.
If we read it theologically and pastorally, yes. I mean, I would, in terms of interpreting it and applying it, I would say the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think, I think Paul's argument is based on ethnic or Jewish identity. We'll say that.
Yes. I agree with that because he gets to Jew-Gentile issues in verse 11. So I agree with that. I was just pointing out, you asked a question. I gave you what Longenecker said, and I said, yeah, that's something to think about.
Yeah, and I agree.
But
so you and I, gosh darn it, we agree again.
But Amber, she did make the point that Gentiles have always been included in the past, so they have to be part of that foreknown if they were part of the faithful remnant.
Well, and that's why I said pagan nations versus
right.
So I don't think Paul has ethnicity in mind. I think he has pagan nations or foreign nations and Jewish identity,
right?
People, and there's a remnant within that. So
just to read,
I think that fits the pattern of the Old Testament better. My understanding. Only. I'll kick it back to you, boss.
The prophetic wrestling of who are the people of God. It's not. It ends up being those who I think are the ones that are faithful to following Yahweh, which can include the Gentiles who are included or not. It is the ones who choose to be in, not the ones who rely on their standing as children of Abraham, which is exactly what Paul's been arguing for the whole book.
Yeah. And then when he gets to the verse 3, they have killed your prophets and they have torn out, and he reverses, he puts prophets first. From 1 Kings 19, verse 10, and then also verse 14. He said, I have been very zealous of the Lord, the God of armies, for the sons of Israel have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they have sought to take my life. And then verse 14 is kind of the restatement of that. Then he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of armies, the sons of Israel have abandoned your covenant, tore down your altar, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they have sought to take my life. But here he reverses that and says, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. So he kind of, what's the significance of putting the prophets before the tear down the altars in his citation of that? Anything? Any significance in that? Or is it just, I mean, it seems to me that maybe because he was appealing to prophets that he put the prophets first. I don't know. Or he's just got it wrong.
Well, it means Paul's allowed to change the Bible if he wants to, and it's inerrant.
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying is what's the rhetorical strategy here of they have killed you, putting the prophets there first? I mean, essentially, Paul himself in his Saul days could be guilty of that too.
Well,
But
he's highlighting the voice. That's what prophets are.
yeah,
They're
Well, I was
God's
just-
thunder on earth.
I was just pointing out that he did switch the words around from
Right, but I think
First
he's
King.
fronting that God, they have rejected the message of God and chased after idolatry.
Yeah. Then verse 4, what is the divine response? And
Check
we
yourself.
we get that in 18. I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so 1 Kings 18, it says, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him. Now, a lot of people, we're going to have to revisit the grace thing again, because it seems like nobody ever remembers this stuff. That if you read the story, and this makes perfect sense of grace, the reason why I have kept language and I am leaving language works in both of these is because grace is reciprocal, right? It's the dance. It's the in the ancient Mediterranean world, Paul, is the socioeconomic dance of patron-client reciprocity. And you're given a gift and you return that gift with the appropriate gratitude. And then you receive more benefaction in which you reciprocate with more gratitude. And so the reason why that these people were left there, and the reason why this, Calvinists try to say is a remnant of grace, which means they were predestined in eternity past and determined to not bow. That's not how grace works. Grace is a dance, and in fact, in Paul's day, it was very religious in the sense. The only religious connotation to grace in Paul's day was the three charities, the dancing. Yeah, I know. So what he's saying, this is economic language. That's why in verse 6, he says it's great, no longer on the basis of works, wages. That's also economic language.
Hmm.
So he's saying the divine response is, no, you're not the only one, Elijah, or in this, if Paul's casting himself as Elijah here, you're not the only one. There are others a part of this remnant. He left them in Jerusalem because they didn't bow the knee and kiss. So they maintained in their gracious standing with Yahweh. And so that's why that is, they didn't earn it. It's not works. That wasn't payment, but it was God's gracious choice, right?
We should just say they didn't. You can't purchase grace.
Right.
Well, then you're talking about employment. You're talking about works.
Well,
And
but that's the major economic substructure of it. It's like you can't purchase it, and you can't
Right.
bribe
Yeah,
it. You can't bribe God.
The thing about grace, and Ziba Crook went out of his way to just try to hammer this idea home. Merited or unmerited, either way, patrons can do whatever they want. The key issue about grace is you are receiving something you cannot obtain on your own. That's whether the patron thinks anything of you or thinks that you're even the ill-deserving is going to give you a gift anyway. Either way, that gift is what you. So for what God is doing to them is He is preserving them. And in the story, he's leaving them in the city. And in Romans 9 saying, I just kept them, right? Peter talks about being kept by faith, kept by God. So if you're thinking this is Calvinistic language because you don't understand what grace is, this is how it works. They're still in the dance with Yahweh. They have remained faithful, and so they get to be spared. Is really what's going on there, and that's God's gracious choice to do that because they didn't earn it. It's so much more simple and makes so much more sense instead of trying to do like pre-temporal theories of providence and determinism and all this other business. So that's what he's saying, because if it and he's re-stressing that if it is by grace, that it is no longer on the basis of works, is a restatement of why Paul's been arguing since the very beginning of the book that this is the means by which people are set right with God and in relation with God. It is not this idea of Jewish identitarian, to make Nick happy, way of living. Right? That's what's going on here. It's just because if it was on that basis, grace is no longer grace. If it's something that is owed, go back to chapter 4. Something he's already said, right?
Well, to return to a discussion we had earlier about the God's people as a whole versus the faithful remnant, are we right to see this as essentially what Paul is underscoring is that God has not wiped out all of Israel because there's a faithful remnant chosen by grace? God didn't owe them being spared from his judgment. He chose it by grace that their faithfulness would preserve Israel.
Or the remnant.
Well, that's the discussion, Israel or the remnant. We go back to that.
Yeah, this is just a restatement of all that stuff he was talking about in Romans chapter 4 about why it's in accordance with grace, so the promise will be guaranteed to all those, not only of those who are the law, but also those who are all the faith of Abraham, who's the father of us all, right? Because if it was by works, then the wages are not credited as a favor, but what is due. But to the one who does not work but believes on him who justifies ungodly, his faith is credited. So all that is what you need to remember when you're reading this, and don't follow the rabbit trail we just followed about Calvinism. so that's kind of what's going on here. So when he says it's on the basis of works, since otherwise grace is no longer grace, he's just repeating what he said in Romans chapter 4.
So in my version of I don't even know what I'm using. I mean, I guess I have a version of the NASB open here, but so Nick, this is a question for you, because in verse 6 it has a note that instead that it is no longer on the basis of works. It has a note there that says literally out of, that it is translated out of
it's
the basis of works.
It's just a simple ek preposition, just
so
out of works. Probably you would render it something like ek being denoting a sense of source from works, works,
right, which makes me wonder, because in covenant faithfulness, the covenant is made, but there is merit in maintaining that relationship, that covenant relationship. You can't buy the relationship in covenant, but there is merit. You have to follow certain things to maintain relationship with Yahweh. There is the Torah that has to be followed to stay in that relationship. And I can't, it's just stuck in my head there.
Yeah. And depending on how you understand Christianity, there's grace and you have to continue to grow in the grace of God.
Or if you just say a magic incantation, then you're good and it's free.
Well, I mean, you are a Baptist, Nick.
Not that kind of Baptist.
Yeah, but I have a question about that, because I think what's the word there?
There's lots of words there.
Well, the no longer. Uketi, yeah. I mean, if righteousness come, if the law could give righteousness, then surely righteousness would be, works of the law or whatever. If you think about Galatians, so why is Paul saying no longer?
It depends on how you understand.
Because you could read that almost as if he's saying it was that way, but it's not now. And I think that's getting to what Amber was saying.
Yeah, and then you've got the issue of, well, that so much, variegated nomism or covenantal nomism was correct until Paul came along. Which then you have genuine severance between Israel's history, law, and ethics from what Paul sees. I'm looking at Uketsi right now, trying to find what Porter says on this, because he's usually fairly helpful. Translating it as no longer is a little.
Yeah, I mean, he's not talking about righteousness here. He's talking about election, right? And he's talking about.
Let's talk about grace.
Right.
Yeah, he's talking about grace and election. And so if we take in the covenantal nomism view of Judaism, it's you're in by grace, you stay by works, going about doing. And so if he's talking about the election here of it's no longer on the basis of works, he doesn't mean righteousness is no longer on the basis of works. He's talking about going about doing the temple cult and kosher and all of that. That's no longer the identity of the elect people of God. It can't be that, because grace has to allow for the Gentiles, right? And if God is the God of both the Gentiles and the Jews, which he made that point in chapters 2 and 3, then it can't be on the basis of works. So that because if it was, then it's no longer grace, and God has to tell the Gentile converts to be Judaizers, which he's not going to do, and Paul hates that and all that. So I'm guessing, since the issue is election and not righteousness, the reason why he's saying it's no longer on the basis of works, he's not talking about righteousness anyway. He's just talking about being in the elect people of God is not on the basis of Jewish identitarian practices. Is that what he's saying here, as far as no longer on the basis of works? Because he's not talking about righteousness. He's just talking about the election of God's people is not on the basis of Torah stuff.
Well, we also have to
it's a point that he's made all through the thing. So when he says no longer on the basis of works, he's not saying that righteousness ever was. He's saying that election used to be, but not now.
Well, and then you've got, so look at that might be complicated by the final phrase in verse 5. There's a remnant chosen by grace. So the question is, if we take grace in the sense that you and Barclay and De Silva say, and I agreed 100%, we're not talking about some metaphysical pixie dust.
Right.
Paraphrase that for us so the audience will understand. So in verse 5, chosen by grace or something like that, how would you elucidate what Paul's actually saying? So give us a paraphrase. Don't just say grace. Find a different word that you think captures. Is it election by gift, by God's reciprocal gifting, or is it a selection? So basically, would you be saying something like, just so the audience can track with us, because that may help answer verse 6. If so too, at the present time, there is a remnant selected in accordance with God's gift or God's favor. And if that's the case, then if it's by God's divine favor, it's not based on works. It's no longer based on works. Otherwise, God's divine favor would no longer be divine favor. Do you see what I'm saying? So if we just translate it as grace, we're automatically bringing baggage with us on that. And I'm not saying that's bad, but if we're going to capture that reciprocity, I don't think Paul thinks works on the basis. I don't think Paul's thinking about ethics. I don't think he's thinking about Torah or law or anything like that. I think he's talking, and even then striving or earning, I don't think the issue is earning there, as if you could just earn God's salvation. But if election is not on the basis of works, then you have something different. It's not about salvation.
Yeah, you have the election of beneficence.
Yeah, exactly. If you've been, so you would say the election
or benefaction, gifts, benefaction, that works too. It's the election of,
and that actually works with elect, because you could render it something more like selection or picking out I mean, not to say the phrase, that'll trigger a few folks, choice meats, but you do have kind of a sense of God has the right to choose those who benefit.
Habakkuk 1:16 could be reasonably translated choice meats, but Okay.
Well, the Lexham English Bible says literally according to selection of grace in the note that they put there. So
Yeah, I mean, election, election of grace. Yeah.
So then what we're saying
I don't
is
know why
you,
they would
there's
say selection. I mean,
it's not
election.
about working your way into God's good grace because God elects. God does this. And if we take grace there in a beneficiary sense, and that actually ties very nicely with father language, God has father language because that's inheritance rights, that's economics, that's legacy, that's basically the father would decide on the basis of that. So
I mean,
actually
go
you
to
have,
Romans chapter 8 for all that fatherly lovey-dovey stuff. Because when
yeah,
he's talking
well,
about grace,
if that's the case, then
no,
you
because
have
here is
beneficiary
clearly
imagery.
this is clearly drawing on patron language.
Right. I'm not that literally does not contradict anything I've said. In fact, that focuses it. If you have patron-client relationship here, God is the patron who has the ultimate right to do these things. That's Romans 9. God
Yeah.
has the sovereignty, that is the right and power to do what he wants to do. But then the question is, what does it please God to do? It please God to do things by benefaction and incorporation rather than having us earn our way into being his benefactor.
I don't think what Paul
I'm
says on
kidding
the
on that.
basis of
I'm
works
kidding
is
on that
talking,
part.
huh?
I was kidding on that last throwaway
Okay, right.
line,
Because
though.
I don't think the basis of works ever meant earning. I think it meant covenantal practice.
So we don't have to have okay, are we still talking? So here's where Jew and Gentile or just Jew comes in, because how does that work then?
Because what he's saying is, it is by grace. It's no longer on the basis of doing Jewish exclusive practices like kosher, temple, cult.
For Gentiles or for Jews as
Sabbath.
well? Because Paul still does those things. So that you're bringing up a whole big issue.
Yeah,
there,
I know
Christian.
he
And I'm
does,
with
but
you
he's
on that.
but
We
he's
can go
saying
down that rabbit
election is
trail
not
all night
about.
long.
But that's ideaphora for Paul. He's saying election is not on the basis
For
of that.
Gentiles.
I think for Jews too. I mean,
Ooh, so
Paul,
now you're gonna get
no. Paul
a
says
lot
in
of
1
folks
Corinthians
unhappy.
9, if I'm going to hang out with Gentiles, I'm going to eat a ham sandwich. I'm not saying he did.
Sure.
I'm just saying he could, and it would be
I
the
mean,
end of the world.
Sure. Fine.
Or-
go ahead, boss.
well,
No, second boss. You're second
But
boss. I'm first boss.
election of grace is not on the basis of doing Jewish exclusive practices, which is what Paul means by on the basis of works, because in light of Christ, it can't be.
Well,
Because
the Old
then
Testament
he
is
has
all
to
about
pay-
grace.
Then
and
Yahweh has
benefaction.
employees and he has to pay wages. Romans chapter 4. That's why it's
Well-
not on the basis of that, because the Gentiles do not have to do Jewish stuff to be Christians. To be
Some
part
they
of the
do, yeah.
election
You're
of
not
God.
allowed to have
Well,
sex with other men or anything like that. So there are some things that Paul thinks are applicable to Gentiles from the Jewish
Yes,
law, like Leviticus
and he
still
enumerates
applies.
them very well in chapter
Well,
1. We did
all
that
right.
episode.
Well,
All right,
forgive me
we're
if you
annoying
touched
Derek.
on
I'm
it.
sorry, boss. Sorry, friend. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
forgive me if you touched on it and I just missed it, but like as I'm reading that, I do believe it's a Jewish focus, and what he's saying is like reiterating it's not their law keeping that made them faithful. It was their belief in Jesus Christ, something like that.
No. Okay. I think no, but I don't mean no in the sense that Christ is not
Mm-hmm.
involved. I think the initial aspect of the remnant, or even of all of Israel, is God's gracious selection of them, and that of course is Exodus all over again for a
Okay.
specific purpose. And then you have and it was on nothing they did, because they weren't doing anything. Literally they were in
Right.
bondage. They were oppressed, they were enslaved. And God, so the whole point is, I would argue, divine priority, or the priority of divine action. That's what election might have,
So
a
you're-
connotation there. But sorry, go ahead.
I was saying you're like doing the Deuteronomy 32:9 where
No, I'm
Israel
doing
is
Exodus
God's
6,
portion.
6, where God basically says, I will deliver you out and do
Mhm.
all that.
Nick
Then
is just
Deuteronomy
ready to
follows
get to
on.
chapter 12, where Paul starts spouting off the new Torah
No,
of a
I want
bunch
to
of
get to Romans
commands
16
for you
and
to
talk about
obey.
Junia. Why are we
Because
even
Nick,
here?
the legalist, wants a bunch of things that he has to obey
You
because
got
it
me
makes it
convinced with
easier.
Southern
But he
Baptist,
wants
dude.
Torah part 2, and he wants to impress God with his ability to
Dude, have
do
you seen me?
Christian
I'm already
work.
impressive to God. Divine handiwork here. Boss, go ahead. You've been very patient with me being a pain in the butt.
No, actually, it's given me a lot of time to kind of think this through in my, and I just don't. I just don't know that it has to be any more complicated than God is reminding them of the pattern of the entire Old Testament and saying, I have set you apart. You didn't do anything to earn it. That's not, but there is, I just don't think it's any more complicated than reminding them of the pattern of the Old Testament, reminding them of the Jewish history, which his Gentile audience will identify with because it's there, but it's there as the vehicle of the Jewish identity of the Jewish nation.
I agree that it's not complicated, but I do think verse 6 has something you have to figure out when he says no longer on the basis of works. What did he mean? And what I think he means is the election of grace, the election of beneficence, or the election of gift, all that is not on the basis of anything that's Jewish exclusive. Because if it was, then it's no longer grace, and it's also no longer Gentile included, you know.
Well, it's Jews were not legalists, like they
Right.
just weren't, and so it's one of those no longer on the basis of works. Probably is. I mean, if we want to be paraphrastic with it, you would say all that.
That's why I said Jewish exclusive practices, like
that's just new
temple cult,
perspective.
like
that doesn't exist.
Oh, whatever. It's all of it. I'm not saying it's. I'm just saying the Jewish exclusive stuff, like temple cult, kosher, circumcision.
So you're tying all that into the word ergon.
No, I'm saying this. Yes, because that's what Paul means. He's saying it's not on the basis of works.
I wish I had contact with Paul. Can we dig him up and ask him?
No, I'll explain what Paul meant when I get to heaven, because I don't think, you know.
Oh yeah, just give Paul 5 minutes of your time and he'll agree.
That's right. I'll tell him what he really meant.
Paul, you were down with apocalyptic, right?
I mean, I'll say first off, why are you using yourself as
the
example here when they don't even like you in Rome, or they've heard you're trying to clear up rumors about yourself?
Well, part of me thinks he would just say, "Bro, you definitely overthought what I said there."
Yeah.
Paul's like, you thought about this more than I did. I was just trying to get some dough to get.
What does it mean to say if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works? I was trying to get them to pass the plate around. What does he mean? I'm saying go back to chapter 4, and he explains this already. What he means? It's grace.
Well, okay, so you got an issue here then, Pritchett. Verse 7. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly they did not obtain? The elect among them did.
Yeah.
But the rest were hardened.
Yeah. Romans 9:30. He already said this. This is nothing new.
But then you have the issue of obtained it versus works. Obtained what on the basis of what?
The gift of election in God's new covenantal eschatological people.
Apocalyptic.
In Christ. Huh?
Apocalyptic. Christ hasn't been introduced here yet. He's talking about the history of Israel and the stubbornness of that. It's not okay, I'm not trying to sound super weird. It's not that Jesus is irrelevant, because Jesus is all about this. The issue is he's making historical narratival claims, trying to figure that out. That is, again, Pritchett, that's why the issue of is it Jew or Gentile or just Jew plays a part in this.
Primarily Jew, but if you want to get pastoral, it's fine for
I mean, I don't. Okay, anyway,
no,
I can tell.
What is the Paul press? He's talking about
I'm
Jesus. He cleared this up in Romans chapter 9, verse 5. We've already talked about this. The Messiah, God over all, blessed forever. Amen. Right? That follow it through.
Jesus is called God there.
History to the present. Jesus is the ground of righteousness. He is the ground of election. He is the chosen one.
He's the very charisma of our being, and Jesus is like, oh boy.
Paul is saying in this present time, a remnant according to God's grace, primarily Israel or all Israel. I don't care. I'm just saying Longenecker makes a good point. That's all I said 40 minutes ago.
I'm not disputing that. It's a good point.
And I'm just saying
there's probably more to it.
What is obtained, what Israel seeking, it has not obtained. Why? Because they pursued righteousness on the basis of works. It's just a restatement of Romans chapter 9, verse 30. But those who were chosen, those who were elect, those who were part of this gift, they did obtain it by grace. and especially Paul, because Paul was a persecutor of the church. It wasn't like we have soteriology 101 in the audience somewhere. It was
Hop on, boss. Set us straight.
reference to, but it was silly for sure. It was talking about what Nick was saying. I'm just going to go with that. I have no idea.
Actually, he was talking about a video that was made by Rogue Calvinists, but that's yeah.
That makes sense too. But okay, so in his John 6 debate with Dr. White, you know, he was talking about those people who were in right relationship with Yahweh became followers. Well, Paul obviously was in wrong relationship with Yahweh. And so Paul, being knocked off his horse on the road to Damascus, clearly was in the wrong and standing in opposition to what Yahweh was doing in Christ during, you know, his persecution of the church. And yet he obtained it too. So this election of grace is based on the gift in Christ, you know, not on the basis of grace, which go again, Zebra Crook, go read it. Cost, you know, benefit analysis. Paul went through that whole thing. Could Paul have done otherwise? Yes, it's very clearly yes. So don't overread that. But I'm just saying it is not merely those who are in right relationship that found their way. Even people like Paul did, which I think going back, maybe Paul is a great example. Maybe I just answered my own question. Why did Paul begin with Paul? Because he is a part of this grace, even though he was the least deserving to be of it. So maybe he is a good representative of Israel, because he was actually in wrong relationship, but he made the wise decision to obey the word of the Lord, because he was not disobedient, as Paul says himself, to explain why he got on board with God's calling on his life. So he says, I was not disobedient. So there you go. But yeah, he's a good example here, because he's saying, yeah, grace is given to all of the people in Christ. If you're on Team Jesus, and it's not Team Jewish stuff, and that's all verse 7 means, or verse 6 means. And so verse 7, what Israel is seeking is just they didn't find it, because Romans 9 already answered that question. They pursued a law of righteousness. They didn't even arrive at the law, much less righteousness, right? Gentiles weren't looking for it, but they found it. But he's making the same point about Israel here that he made 930, that they didn't find it. Those chosen in grace did.
Are we seeing a direct?
Fact, Paul is a good example of this, because he is the ill-deserving he was, you know, zeal, not according to knowledge, was fighting against, you know, persecuting Jesus' church in opposition to Yahweh, and Yahweh still, by grace, appeared to him on the road to Damascus. So yeah, that's what he's saying. It has to be Team Jesus. It can't be on the basis of works anymore, because that's not the defining nature of God's election. It's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest were hardened. Well, he already explained why they were hardened. There's Leighton Flowers' judicial hardening.
Yeah. So are we seeing a direct connection with verse 5 and verse 7, because you got ekloge used in both? So
yeah, selection.
So yeah, right. So you have that mention, God's choice, and then those who were chosen obtained it. So those who he's talking about in verse 5 that were chosen according to grace, or the selection of grace, are the ones who obtained it, right? Verse 5 and 7 have that direct connection. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't have the inflection that implied I was asking it.
Yeah, so every time you think, oh, I'm the only one, you're always like, no, I have others.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it gets us through 1 Kings. But the rest were hardened. And to make this point, he goes to Deuteronomy 29:4.
Mm-hmm.
And that says, yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. And Isaiah says something very similar. For the Lord poured over you a deep sleep. He has shut your eyes. And I'm guessing it's the eyes that connect these things. Why is your camera? Does your camera like follow your hand?
Yeah,
I
it's
was wondering
really
about that.
weird. I got a new iPad for church because everything else was dying. So if I
Very cinematic. Anyway,
Yeah, it's very off-putting, especially when my mother saw it and had a freak out.
yeah.
Sorry,
Shut
Mom.
your eyes, the prophets, and he has covered your heads, the seers. So Yahweh, like with Pharaoh, is once again the agent of hardening. Just as written, God gave them the spirit of stupor, eyes not to see, and ears to hear, or eyes to see not in the NASB, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. That's
Mm.
an addition by Paul. He's kind of adding that down to this very day, which goes into what we were talking about. What does he mean by in the same way then at the present time, there's also a remnant like there's always been.
Isn't the down to this very day, isn't that coming from Deuteronomy 29:4? You said it's an addition by Paul.
Yeah, well, and it's is it yet to this day in Deuteronomy 29?
Mm.
Until or up till.
Well, I'm reading
Yeah.
the LEB, which says even to this day.
Yeah.
What does it
But-
literally say?
The verse begins with that in Deuteronomy and it ends with that in
Right. Until the day, this, literally.
so
Yeah,
what-
they have
what-
to do.
well, it goes back to the prophets and the altars thing where Paul reverses it.
Mhm.
He puts that at the end, right?
Mhm.
And I think he's doing
I
that
see what you're saying. Okay.
thematically. That's a Pauline.
Right. So he's including that just to show, like, for a
Yeah,
very
it's a
specific
change.
reason.
It's,
Like
a,
this is
it's
this
a
is still
change, not
happening.
necessarily an
even today.
addition, but it's a change to the
Right.
text.
He's punctuating that point to say, like, this is still going on today, even.
Right. Kind of like the whole thing about the present time in verse
Mhm.
5. And he started with the prophets so that he could, he evokes Elijah and then leads with the statement about the prophets and then goes to the altars instead of the other way around.
Mm.
You having fun over there?
Not one bit. Please continue.
There's got to be a way to shut that off because it's really
Leighton said that he should have said he had his own cameraman. For a second, I was like, he's not like making his wife like go behind the camera and zoom in.
Oh, that's a good idea. Next time I might just do that. Man, honey, just sit there for 2 hours. And
it's like,
listen
honey,
to
I'm animated. You got to make sure the camera follows me.
honey, watch what I'm doing to Pritchard. He's gonna get real mad. I'm gonna mean text after this. This is great. Kick all the ADHD people being like, stop it, Nick. What?
yeah.
What?
I'm trying to read, so it's good that I'm not looking at
Oh,
the
we
screen.
all know you can't read.
Be like,
Trying to
dude, what's
read.
wrong with you? Anyway, so he makes that little switcheroo again. Paul, this is what I'm saying to people. If you quote a verse and you get the word order wrong, so did Paul. So if you don't get it perfect, don't let some Bible Nazi come up and say, you didn't say that correctly. Who cares? 'Cause Paul
Well,
apparently
yeah,
does.
Paul's probably going by memory. Most people don't do that nowadays. They just,
No, Paul,
they
Paul
look it
had his
up.
King James version with him all the time. Tertius broke that bad boy out.
Look, if Denzel Washington can remember the whole Bible in Braille, Paul
KJV Braille.
needs to do better. Okay.
Yeah.
I-
Paul's ain't nobody got time for this.
Amber, you look like you were about to say
JP
something.
didn't even turn on a light.
He went,
I don't. This is a new office. I don't have Sorry,
setup.
New
No.
One of those like
Cool
circular
occasion.
light things that.
but
all the
see,
cool
if I
people
get
have.
one of those lights, then I'll be like Braxton applying makeup to knock the shine off of his dome. Him and Tim Stratton, when we did a stream, they were both trying to get the shine off their heads. Just don't have a light.
Probably look like a bunch of eggs sitting in the sunlight.
Yes,
Yeah, we have hair privilege, so we don't think about
that's
that. too
right.
much.
We don't have to
Yeah.
do that, but it was
All
funny.
kinds of good hair too.
No, Braxton has a good beard. He's just bald, and so is Tim. And like, they have their set lighting, and then all of a sudden it's like gleaming, and you can't see anything on the
Oh,
screen.
so
until
they
add
basically look like this.
So God is the agent giving them. Let's get back to the Bible instead of makeup. Just as it is written. So he's appealing to both Deuteronomy and Isaiah,
Well, there's
saying
a prejudice.
the law and the prophets both back up what I'm saying. God is doing this to Israel. Now, this is like in the case with Pharaoh, right? They're out of step. They're rejecting. They have zeal but no knowledge, etc. So I'm guessing Paul's consistent with his own thinking on that. But God has a saving purpose with giving them this spirit of stupor and not letting them see anything and not letting them hear anything, even in the present. Right? Nick?
Right.
Sure. Huh?
Huh? Sure. No, God has decided that he doesn't want the choices. So
Six packs
I'm
sold
going to play the
separately.
Calvinist here. See, God is doing this on purpose because he doesn't want to elect those people. Because before these Israelites were born or did anything good or bad, God's elective grace excludes them. So God uses means to keep his non-elect people non-elect. Is that?
I mean, you kind of think about it. God gave that to them, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. It's like, why would it? Seems kind of redundant for God to give them something he could have just predetermined. Unless there's,
That's
we're
Layton's
just a bunch of
argument.
switches waiting to get flipped at certain points, in which case God is interacting in time, which is
See, but
interesting.
Nick, you're flattening it out because God uses means. And so the spirit of stupor and eyes to see not is means by which God keeps the unelect, right?
Well, I mean, if we take these things seriously, the elect obtained it or gained it or actively seized it through agency, but the rest were hardened, or you might render that as something like became hardened, or actually dulled. So they're thickened mentally, epistemologically,
Right.
spiritually, whatever.
God is doing this, though. That's the point of that's
God
the point.
gave them. God gave it to them, yeah, which means they didn't previously have it.
Yes, but why is he doing this? What is it in Deuteronomy and then also in Isaiah that provoked God to do this? Because surely Paul's not just merely proof texting and saying, "Oh, these couple verses sound good. I'll just use these for no reason." Right?
Goes back to the message of Deuteronomy, which is summed up in the first chapter of Joshua. Choose this day whom you will serve. Are you in or are you out? And if you're out, then the inclination, God allows us in the hardening to just, if we're going to be dumb, he's going to let you be dumb. If you're going to choose to follow Yahweh, you're going to choose to follow Yahweh. God's going to let you make that choice and follow that inclination that you have already in your mind, in your heart, that you've already decided. God's going to be like, okay, you're going to go that way. I'll just let you kind of grease the wheels and let you go that way as far as you're going to take that nonsense.
Well, it
Yeah, but in
reveals
the
a God
broader
who
context
engages
of-
with humankind substantially too. And basically,
see-
is fine, you want to act like that? I'll throw gas on you.
Mhm.
No, I agree completely, but yet there's still hope in chapter 11 for Israel, and there's hope in Deuteronomy 20:29 because
And
he's
the
like,
whole-
you're going to be in the wilderness, and I think Paul's talking about the new wilderness. He's like, yeah, I mean, the Lord, yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. And he led them in the wilderness for 40 years, and your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your feet. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk. He's talking about, like, okay, so you remember the Exodus, and I I led you out of the land of Egypt and Pharaoh and all of his servants and to all this good land and the great trials which your eyes have seen, those great signs and wonders. Yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, because the Yahweh is not. He's like, you saw all this in the same way that the Jews understand everything, but Yahweh is still not giving them a heart to know things. But yet, even though when they were in the wilderness, he sustained them, he held them up, just like he held up Pharaoh, right? Go back to Romans 9, for the purpose I've allowed you to stand, right?
Right. But every time in the pattern from Genesis 3 all the way through, God, every time God tosses them out to teach them a lesson, do they learn it? Sometimes temporarily they kind of get it, but then they start messing up again. It's a pattern over and over and over again. God tosses them out to teach them a lesson, to give them a new heart, and they just never get there. They keep choosing rebellion. God's choosing to try to bless them, and humans are choosing to rebel every single time. And he keeps, you're not gonna do it. I'm gonna toss you out and give you another chance to bring you back and try again, over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, but it's like, no matter it seems like in Deuteronomy 29, Yahweh's saying, you've seen all of this stuff that I did, but yet I'm not giving you a way to know this, because what did they do the whole time? They just complained, oh, we want to go back, all of that. Right after they left, there's, God crushes the army in the sea, and all of a sudden they're building a golden cow. So it's like no matter what Yahweh does, right?
Mm-hmm.
They Gungus move, to evoke Dr. White again. He's a big fan of that word. They're Gungus mooing, and he's like, okay, so the Lord's not giving you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor eyes to see. So I've led you in the wilderness. I'm gonna keep your clothes not wearing out, your sandals on your feet. So there is a little bit of sustaining, in the same way that I think that Paul's leading up to for what he's going to talk about in the rest of the chapter. So even though we read this stuff about spirit of stupid, there's still grace in the fact that he's going to allow Israel to still exist, right?
Well, even more so, God has bound everyone over into disobedience so that he might show mercy on all people.
Right, but we're not there yet. But I'm just saying, you can see
you were alluding to it. I just made it obvious.
I'm saying Paul's already alluding to it. Paul's already
setting it up.
The melody here is God's giving them a spirit of stupor. They're not going to be able to hear. They're not going to be able to see, even right now. But he's also saying this is a wilderness period. He's evoking that with Deuteronomy.
Right. At this point in Deuteronomy, though, this is the renewal of the covenant. Moses has been with these people since the Exodus, and at this point, he's been with them over 40 years. And he's like, "Look, you guys are historically too dumb to get it. So you're gonna be stupid. You're gonna make the bad choice, and God's gonna let you do that." Like, he's reminding them again of the pattern in Deuteronomy. Like, it's not predestined in the fact that God has gone back and said, you're going to be doing this, from history past, that this is predetermined. It's like, he's been their pastor for 40 years and he knows these idiots. Every single time you get the chance to choose to do what God wants you to do, you choose to give him the finger and do your own thing. And he knows that because he's been with them, he's pastored them, he's listened to them lie, and he's settled their disputes. He has it's just like, I know what you're going to do because I've been living with you for 40 years and I know how dumb you are.
Yeah, and in Isaiah 29, Isaiah 29 is the warning, right? It's a real banger of a song, but it's a warning song, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also kind of alluded to in Isaiah 6, right? Isaiah 6:9.
Well, I'm talking about 29:10. For the Lord has poured over you a deep sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets. He has covered your heads, the seers. So it's kind of mishmash into this quotation here in Romans 11. And that song in Isaiah 29 is a warning.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So you want to run around being idiots, I'm going to let you run around being idiots.
All right. Well, I'm going to make you idiot. I'm going to make you even bigger idiots for having been idiots, is what I think he's saying.
Well,
Because
Isaiah
God's not
starts
giving
out-
innocent people here a spirit of super. He's just saying, you've been bad, and so this is what I'm doing. I'm not going to, because you were idiots, I'm going to make you even bigger ones. Like with this,
Well,
here's to hear
Isaiah
not.
starts out at the beginning. You all are dumber than farm animals, and are you brain damaged because you don't get it? Like he starts out with, "You all are stupid." I mean, chapter 1:3, an ox knows its owner and a donkey knows its master's manger, but Israel doesn't know. My people don't understand. You're dumber than farm animals. I mean, he starts off insulting their intelligence and that they're too dumb to get it. I mean, it's just playing through that theme that runs through Isaiah. Like, how dumb are you people that you don't get it?
Yeah. So, and then he goes to David. We've got, back-to-back Psalms again. He did this earlier in chapter 10, and he's doing it here. Psalm 69, 22 and 23. This is trap language. May their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. May their eyes be, there's the eyes thing again. May their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs continually. So it seems like there's this theme here with eyes, right? So may their table become a snare and a trap. So there's something about, and I think this goes back to what Paul was arguing about zeal, but not according to knowledge in the previous chapter here, because, or you could go back to 9 about the stumbling stone, because it seems like all of this is intentional on Yahweh's part, but, you've got to keep reading and come back to finish up the chapter. But I still say that the melody here is bad news for Israel, but there's a harmony here that's, before Paul gets explicit about holding out hope and grafting in and chopping off and graft back in again that they repent and believe and all, before he even gets to there, you have that implicit in these in the wider context of Deuteronomy and Isaiah and the Psalms.
And well, if you look at Isaiah, especially Isaiah, if you look at he uses the eyes imagery is tied to there he uses the almonds a lot in the almond tree, and that it's a word play that you lose in English, because the word for almond and the Hebrew word for to see are pronounced almost exactly the same. So there's an interplay of almonds and to seeing, and eyes and understanding is a word play in Isaiah, but it's a sound based one that you don't get in English.
Well, that's like what is it, automatopoeia? What is it?
Where the word describes the sound.
Yeah.
Yes, the word describes the sound.
Huh.
It's like tohu vavohu. It's doubling down on nothingness as a concept and idea of chaos absurdity, because it plays on sound
and it's a poem, but not a
Mhm.
poem, because John MacArthur said that Genesis 1 has no poetic elements because a supercomputer in the 80s told him. But no, seriously. No, he said once that there's no poetic elements in Genesis chapter 1 because, and this was a long time ago before AI or anything else. He's like, we used a computer to analyze this. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it rhymes if you read it in Hebrew. So
yeah, I was like, I think that's just because they want like rough and tough, rigid, literal history there.
Yeah, which, I mean, I'm fine with it being historical in a sense, but it's just, I mean, it's poetic. Just read it out loud. Anyway.
So is there any significance? I noticed that you got Elijah, who was being persecuted whenever he said his thing. And then you have David in Psalm 69 was also under persecution when he said his thing. Paul was a persecutor of the church. So maybe there's a through line for him on those two.
Which is probably the through line. Well, that goes all the way back to evoking I'm descendant of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin. We started with Saul, and my name used to be Saul, and I persecuted the church, and yet here I am. I am the proof that God has not cast off all of Israel because of me.
Hmm.
I think, if anything, I still think that was probably a tactical. I'm not impressed with it, but I mean, I still think that it works. But I had to get there by thinking, well, if even Paul, right, then God hasn't tossed off Israel, because Paul would deserve to be tossed off, as much as anybody. So I still like his approach in 1 Corinthians, where he said, "Least of all me," but because Paul's the least of all in my mind compared to like James and Peter and all the others. But I don't know. Everyone loves Paul. So y'all Paul folks, y'all think he deserves to be number one. But I do like what he's doing here. I like that through line, Derek. I like I like the but he keeps going back to Isaiah and Deuteronomy, which he's been doing constantly. And I like, Amber, how you keep making the point that Israel are dumber than animals, and that's God's not afraid to call them out on their nonsense. But it just goes to show, though, Nick was talking about there's agency here as well, that you can't just think because Paul is looking back on this that everything was like fated to happen this way. There's like a reason that Yahweh gives people spirits of stupor. It's not like he's just trying to arrange action figures on a battlefield or anything. He gets Ezekiel to do that kind of thing, but he doesn't do it himself, I guess. But,
Right. It wasn't an end unto itself generally.
yeah. So it's like this seems to be like Paul has set up the wilderness issue with the wider context of Deuteronomy 29. So it seems like Paul, he's making a good argument here. It started a little wonky for me, but it seems, but the whole thing, I think I would understand it far less if I didn't go back and look at those contexts. I mean, as Derek pointed out, Elijah was being whiny and David was being whiny because, they're all after me. But no, I'm just kidding. No, they had it rough. And I don't know that Paul's necessarily feeling like, well, Paul's under pressure in this letter because they all think they've all heard rumors about him that are slanderous, and he's trying to clear that up too. So, and if you read like 2 Corinthians, Paul goes like chapter after chapter defending himself. So, Paul has he does have a martyr complex,
Well, and that's why I kind of saw it more like whenever I said it, I framed it more as Paul was a persecutor because with Elijah, he was being persecuted by Jezebel, who was the wife of the king of Israel. So Paul was on the other side of that at one point too. He was the Israel persecuting God's people,
And you look at those stories that he chooses. Elijah, what happens? He winds up out in the cave and he ends up finding God, not in the big powerful displays, but in that quiet whisper. And David gets sent out. He's running for his life, and he winds up, off in the wilderness for a while, runs into Saul, passes that test of not killing the king, and like there's more going on there in those stories than just whiners who have had a rough life. They have encounters with God in those places of being cast out, where they are running for their lives. And Paul does the same thing. He winds up persecuting the church, making a bunch of mistakes, and winds up meeting Jesus face to face. I mean, I think that's part of the wandering metaphor, that theme that's going on here.
Yeah, and it seems like when we get to next week, just the very first rhetorical question in verse 11 seems to actually start to walk back a little bit, in case you wanted to overread God hardening them and blinding them and giving them a spirit of stupor. I don't think that, I think that we can read too much into that to where we think of like impossible for them to come out of it, that God is placing them so fog-headed that they could never, that they're unreachable. Like Paul seems to
Remember,
soften that in the very next verse, in verse 11. So
and the message of the prophets over and over and over again. Look at Jonah. Look at I mean all of them. This can stop at a minute. All you have to do is turn back to God. Just shuv, return, return. That word is saturated in prophetic books. That's all they had to do. It didn't take monumental effort. It didn't take a whole bunch of anything. They didn't even have to be very smart. All they had to do was respond, incline their hearts back to God, and God would have stopped the whole thing.
yeah, I mean, it's like, well, I mean, if God gives them the spirit of stupor, God has to take it away,
Mhm.
though.
Right.
But
Well, yeah, but that could be part of the welcoming back of the turning and returning is the removal of that stupor.
yeah, but it seems to be Paul's going to argue that God has a purpose in that for the present time.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that next week, though. So
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look,
I'm just saying it's easy to overread that and then
Right.
get trapped in the Calvinistic thinking if those are your presuppositions and you come to a text like this and it's like, see,
Mhm.
them
I think
ain't
if you-
elect. God's going to use means to
Mhm.
keep them from ever. Yeah, and it actually proves the opposite point, like
Yeah.
Amber said. It's like God has to intentionally do this because
well, if you look at redemptive history, that is what we see over and over again. God giving
Yep.
people over, they come to their senses, they come back.
Well, that's the thing about looking at the wider context of these Old Testament passages. You miss so much of Paul's argument that he doesn't even put on the page because he's expecting us to do the heavy work of actually reading more than the sentence he wrote. And when you do that, it all seems to make a lot more sense, which is why I don't like these people who take this atomistic approach to Paul's citations of because you'll read in the commentaries, well, there's a reason he only quoted half the verse because only these words actually matter to what it's like. No, wait a minute. You have to bring in all of it. And so
because those words are the only words they needed to know the whole story that Paul
yeah,
was
because I mean, just to put my unbiased critical hat on again, I see where liberal scholars think that Paul's argument is hopeless by this point from where he started in Romans 9 if you don't have the right approach to Paul's use of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I'm as a confessional conservative Christian, I'm like, the Bible's perfect, right? It's God's word and all that. But if you take away those blinders, those presuppositions, and you just look at it, if you're not familiar with what Paul's doing and the way that he's doing it, I understand the critical liberal scholarship who thinks Paul's he's contradicting himself. He's crazy. He's wrote himself into a corner he can't get out of. It's ridiculous, all of that. Because sometimes I read Christian confessional conservative commentaries and think, yeah, you're part of the problem, right? Of making a mess out of this passage because you're not doing the kind of work that Paul expects his audience to do and know their Bible. But and bringing all the not just the larger context of the Old Testament, but just the thematic elements of those contexts and all of that into the story that Paul's trying to write now in the present, because I am sympathetic to think that if either you're going to go get lost and just grit your teeth and say, well, it has to make sense because it's God's word, or you're just going to think this is a complete mess. I'm sympathetic to that because you can read this section of Paul's letter, and if you're not keeping tabs on what Paul has written before and how he's bringing in all of this Old Testament and all of that, it kind of is a mess, if you just read it without understanding the way Paul expects us to read it. And I guess that's begging the question, is Paul a thematic, wider context use of the Old Testament? And I say, if the answer is no, then I will pick apart your exegesis of these 3 chapters just as easy as a critical scholar could, because it does seem like if you're not saturated in the Bible that Paul's drawing from, then it isn't going to make sense like it should.
Well, and the way I kind of see it, you have a culture that was a storytelling culture. So when you reference something, they don't they don't see proof text like we do. They see stories that you're making reference to. That would make sense. Like, as I understand the biblical authors, that would make more sense to me. It's like, I'm referring to this, the story behind that. You obviously, most people couldn't have read it because they're illiterate, but they know the story, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the reminders of, of if you think about, if I will say to you like a line from a song, you're going to know the whole song. I don't have to quote the entire song to make my point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so read your Old Testament, people, or Paul will make a lot
That's
less
right.
sense.
Read it in the Tanakh order. It makes more sense if you read it in the Tanakh order.
Yeah. But I am sympathetic to a lot of the confusion caused by Romans 9 and 11 for both Christians and non-Christians alike if they don't bring all this on board. All right.
Real quick, is the Tanakh order the one that ends with 2nd Chronicles?
Yes.
Okay, because that's actually the Bible reading plan I did this year.
Yeah, if you read it in the original Hebrew Bible order, which ends with Chronicles, it makes a lot more. The story makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's something for everyone to do. Now's the fun part. You're in front of people and you have to do something with this. The what now part. And I can rephrase this. I mean, we know what it is, but I'll go ahead and start off with this because I think the first thing I would say is God is not a God that gives up on his promises, and even I would also stress the point that what Amber was talking about is I would want to teach the themes that Paul recapitulates here in this little section of 10 verses of Israel's pattern in the past, because Paul goes there. That's the whole point of bringing up Elijah. Just as there was a remnant then, there's a remnant now, right? So the biblical pattern stays with God's dealings with his covenant people and with his people today. And I would widen that out to say that God is a merciful God, and even when God sends punishment, it's always in response to human foolishness or stupidity. You're acting as dumb as an animal, as Amber likes to remind us. So, but even then, you've got to pay attention to the fact the broader themes of the Old Testament and the broader themes of the very passages that Paul cites here. Whether it's Elijah, God's like, no, I'm still doing something elsewhere. I have kept people for myself. They have remained faithful. They didn't bow the knee, and so I'm keeping them in grace. They're going to remain just then as it is now. And just as there was in the wilderness, there was a lot of belly aching and complaining and wanting to go back to slavery, no matter what miraculous displays that I gave. I made you wander for 40 years, but I also sustained you for those 40 years. You didn't die off, right? The promise of Abraham continues on through your children, the ones that will be allowed to enter. So there's always that going on with Yahweh. And even in Isaiah's songs of warnings and destruction, and it's going to get really ugly, and you're going to have to fulfill the Deuteronomy curses, there's still going to be a restoration there as well. So in these patterns of Yahweh's dealings and discipline, it's never final until you're dead. There's always a chance with Yahweh that he's not going to give up. So that's kind of what I would go with on this passage. Those are kind of themes that I would bring out. And then I would also clarify the fact that God's grace on election is not based on anything that you're doing, but you have an obligation that if you are in the elect, there is a gratitude that you have to give God in response. And that gratitude is obedience, faithfulness, and loyalty. And that's exactly what we see in those prophets, because why did God leave them in Jerusalem under his protection? Why did he keep them in the language of Romans? Because grace is reciprocal. And as long as you keep that in mind, the idea of divine agency and human interaction with the divine and all of that, and how you shake all that out in your metaphysics makes a lot more sense. and understanding grace on its ancient Mediterranean terms and trying to do metaphysics and philosophical determinism and Calvinism or all of that, that the Calvinists want to talk about, and that the Arminians want to kick against when they're all talking about things the Bible never was. So that's kind of how I see it.
I don't have a lot to add to that, but and I'm not alone in this, kind of seeing Romans 9, 10, 11 as a pretty solid block within the book of Romans. And, that starts off in Romans 9 with Paul talking about his heart for Israel and how he would be a curse for them. Why? Because they're rejecting their Messiah. They're rejecting God, right? And then he goes through the chapter kind of explaining that. Then he gets into Romans 10, kind of expands on that. And he ends Romans 10 quoting the Old Testament, all day long I have held my hands out to a disobedient and defiant people. So it's like this theme of Israel right now is rejecting God. So then you open up chapter 11. Well, has God rejected Israel? Right. The very next verse after the close of Romans 10. And his answer to that is, may it never be, which is a very strong way of saying it. So I like I said, I don't have a lot to add to what Pritchett just said, but that's how I would at least lead up to it, talking about like, okay, so, Israel's rejecting God, they're rejecting God, but is God going to reject them?
Yeah.
Right. May never be. And why? So then that's whenever you kind of get into, well, you don't get into verse 11 yet. They stumbled, but they haven't fallen yet. But, set that up that even though Israel has done this in the past, we've seen the pattern. And so from there, we can gather that this isn't necessarily like, this isn't a permanent thing now because we're not going down to an individual salvific level when we're talking about that. At least I'm not. But as a whole, the pattern of Israel is this way. And when God gives them over, it is for a time, it is for a purpose, not an end unto itself necessarily. And so that would set up the verse 11 for me.
Yeah. Anything to add?
I think I would just simply just kind of talk about this is a message of hope. You're not going to out mistake the grace of God. The pattern of the Bible is very clear. We're not going to mess up so badly when there's never hope. So I think that's
Amen. I think next week we're going to go from 11 to 24. And so we're 2 episodes away from not just one. It's just too much to take the whole rest of the chapter. So we'll probably go all the way to 24, 11 to 24. And then lots of wonderful ideas about the whole security debate again, about, branches cutting off, grafting in, all of that kind of thing. I know that gets in some of these proof texts for the conditional security debate. So that'll be very interesting. But we're still talking about what is Israel, what is the branch, the root, and all that. So that's going to come back up and set up for when we get to verse 26, which is what everyone wants to talk about. And Nick already previewed the fact that we'll probably not be the ones to figure it out on this program, but we're going to explore all of the options. And I'm going to try to get Dr. Allen in here. And I know somebody had mentioned something about Steve Gregg. So that's 2 weeks away, or at least, and if, or 2 episodes away. I don't know if we'll be here every week or not, but hopefully we will be back on schedule every week. And so that verse 26 will come in the following week after the next episode, which will be 11 through 24. And we need to make sure that we have hopefully we can get one of those once saved always saved people on here to explain why their position on this text, because I know people are interested in that theology stuff. So we'll try to do that. Amber, you got anything cool coming up on your channel, or are you going to talk about the other thing, or what?
No, I'm not going to announce the other thing yet, because that's but Wednesday I've got some friends joining me, and we're going to talk about why Leviticus matters. Going to go through some things and clear up some misunderstandings that will make Leviticus easier to read. And I got a big channel announcement coming out probably Friday, because that'll be decided by then, I think. So then I will be announcing that. And it'll be winter break for me. So I've also got, I'll be putting out quite a bit of content over break, I think, and then gearing up for another semester. So we'll have, I got quite a few things going on. But Wednesday is the big one of why Leviticus matters, and then Friday, I think, a big channel announcement. So
Leviticus is a page turner. It's everyone's favorite Old Testament book.
you know what? It's about gratitude and joy. I love the book of Leviticus. It's a
There you
great
go.
book, man.
That's a plug for it that you don't hear very often. It's about gratitude and joy.
Yes, it is.
Leviticus 19 is all about joy. Okay. Naughty people know that chapter. Derek, anything coming up on your channel?
Yeah, I for those who didn't know, remember the whole thing with me and the church split responding to Doreen Virtue, and then I put out my own little video regarding all
made her
that
mad
too.
and got blocked on Twitter.
Yeah. A lot of people don't know that about a week or so after that first video about Heiser, she released another one that was a lot shorter. It was just her, Marsha Montenegro, and Wave Nunnally. And that one didn't get as much attention. So I've been cooking up my own response to that. I finished typing the script. It's over 5,200 words. So I might do the whole 2-part thing. I don't know. And then maybe you guys can weigh in on this. Let me ask you this, because I was talking to Melissa Doherty about this, like trying to be like, all right, which way should I go? Whenever I record, should I do the voiceover and read the script, or should I should I be on camera reading the script? Because I have a trouble like reading a script and being on camera. But if I do it that way, I don't have to edit as much. But if I just do a voiceover, I kind of have to put things on the screen.
You do it like this. And then when you're reading the script, you have this side angle, right? And then you have your display, you have your images, and you cut yourself in and out of that. And then every now and then you look at the camera to emphasize something from your script, and then you just go back. And so you can have your images that you're talking over, your voiceover, but you can also have yourself filmed at an angle, and then every now and then look at the camera to emphasize something, and just play around. And that way that you have you and you have not you.
Yeah, I actually kind of like that idea, just because I don't like spending too much time on editing, and if I'm on the camera, you don't need me to occupy you with other things, right?
Yeah, I don't like editing either. Anyone who watches Theology Geek fitness videos knows that all I do is I talk to the camera, and then I put like B-roll. Sometimes full screen, sometimes in little boxes all around my head. And if you're watching on a cell phone, it's hopeless to see anything that I'm doing. And everyone hates my thumbnails because they're unreadable, and I don't care because I'm not putting effort into it. That's why we have Braxton doing all that stuff for this channel, because I don't know what I'm doing and I don't care enough to learn. Speaking of learning, and if you want to learn something, if you care to learn more about the Bible, you should do what Jamie Russell says and go to trinitysim.edu and learn from people like me, and learn from people like Braxton and Leighton Flowers and Jim Chatham and Chris Featherstone and a bunch of other people. trinitysim.edu, fill out an eval. And we have some great announcements that's going to be coming up from the seminary, hopefully by the end of the year or early next year. This we're very excited about as well. And also subscribe to our channels. When Deep Calls Deeps, go subscribe to Derek P.G. Beeler and subscribe to Trinity Radio if you haven't.
Yeah, I just made a new thumbnail for my channel. So
yeah, do all of that.
Don't you?
Are you getting better? Your thumbnails look better than mine. You know what you're doing.
Yeah, I do. I had a little help.
You're putting in more effort, and if you put in effort, it looks better. I've noticed. But I will never put in the effort. I don't care. See, my channel has to get bigger for me to start caring about that, to where if it makes more money, I can pay somebody to do the things.
That's kind of where I was at.
Right. But if it's not going to ever get that big, I'm not going to ever do the things that will actually make it that big. So it's like that catch-22. Anyway, nobody cares. With that,
don't you have something to share? Don't you have a what Braxton said in the chat?
Oh yeah, that's right.
The hell video or whatever.
Yeah. Tomorrow, Chris is going to answer 30 proof texts about hell, and defending conditional immortality. So tune into that stream. And there's somebody that I'd mentioned that at the top. Who was it? Who said that? Somebody. Anyway, I was talking to somebody at the beginning of the stream that was whining about Joseph L. Had said the clickbait isn't doing you any favors. I think I talked about that at the beginning of the show. And what I replied with is complain to Braxton. He does that stuff. In fact, bombard his stream with Chris Date tomorrow with requests to have him have normal video titles for this series. Like next week's title should be Romans 11. 11 through 24. But anyway, yeah, y'all watch that stream tomorrow. And if you don't catch it live, watch the replay because it's going to be a lot of fun. The thing is, he did this with Leighton Flowers on Calvinism, like 30 plus verses, and they try to get it like 3-minute answers. So it's going to be like 3 minutes per verse. We'll see if they can stick to that. So that should be excited. So y'all watch that tomorrow. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Biblical Rose Gallery here on Trinity Radio and When Deep Calls Deep.